Hey everybody, it's your good buddy Uncle Stan. I told you I'd be back with a lesson for you, so here I am, right? All right. So today I'm going to be actually going through a lesson here for you on that PowerPoint thing. All right, and that PowerPoint thing is really going to be useful if you've done the reading. It's going to make a whole lot more sense because we're not covering everything that's in the reading. We're just covering some major highlights of some things. So here's what I need you guys to do. All right, hopefully you have gone ahead and gotten that note sheet Mr. Bailey's posted for you. Now, again, my understanding is you can type that answers in on the computer, or you can just print it out, fill it out, whatever it is you feel best doing. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started with this. I'm going to go ahead and bring up the PowerPoint here so you can see that. All righty here. So for the most part, you guys are going to see here that, well, it's going to be highlighted and underlined. Now, if something happens to not be highlighted and underlined, you guys can read through this. I'm sure you can see the words because they match with your note. So make sure you get everything filled in. I'm sure this will make sense to you. All right. This isn't, my understanding is you guys have done this kind of stuff before. So there's nothing new here, nothing new under the sun, as I've heard said. So here we go. We're going to go ahead and get started. All right. Now, north and south, two main areas of differences we're going to be looking at today. The first one, when you're like, well, what are we? There's so many. I know. But we're going to focus in on two today, folks. Now, the first one deals with the economy. So if you printed it out and your piece of paper doesn't say economy at the top, you're on the wrong piece of paper. Okay, if it says something like immigrants and immigration, you got the wrong one. Okay, so you're gonna be looking at economy. All right, so the first thing you need to know about the northern economy, again, this is all stuff that you probably have already covered, probably in some readings and videos about the industrialization of the North. Okay, so North had a whole bunch of industrialization. That means factories. All right, so textile mills, things like that. Now, when these textile mills and factories, you have this thing called mass production. And mass production is just another way of saying they're making a whole lot of the same thing in those factories. Mass producing. It means they're just making a whole bunch of it. Okay. So when you talk about textile mills, they're making a whole bunch of, thread and a whole bunch of, stuff not just the thread, but the fabric as well. They were making tons of it all in one place. It was like a nonstop kind of thing. All right. Now, you also have new machinery, tons of it coming in, guys. Man, it's hard to explain how different the northern economy was starting to look. Now, you probably have heard about the steam engine. Steam engine thing, that was big because when factories and textile mills first came to the north, and in the U.S. in general, but in particular up in the north, the Lowell mills, and they had to be on a river because the river, basically serves as their power source. But once the steam engine comes along, those factories can be built just about anywhere. So, like, say, for example, the Midwest, what we call the Midwest now. All right, that was a big thing. But factories could be built just about anywhere because of this new machinery. Now, when this starts happening, you get all kinds of different workers. Now, I'm sure you've heard about the young women as young as 8 years old were working in some of these places. And they didn't have much education. They tried to make a little money for a lot of different reasons. But they wanted things to be better. They wanted better working conditions, for example, and you would too. Everybody does. Everybody wants to work in the best position possible. So they started to form these things called trade unions. All right. Now, these trade unions today, we just simply call them unions for the most part. And but they were really instrumental in the early part of this industrial revolution, and really through this time period, trying to make things better for workers. They were very instrumental in that. And one of the things that they would do is they would go on strikes. Now, you probably have read or heard that strikes were a bit of a dicey situation for a lot of workers because in some places they were deemed illegal. And in other places where they may be legal, well, those workers could just easily be replaced by new workers. And so it was a little tough for some of those places to strike. Now, some did, and they got better conditions, and they were successful. But it was still a pretty tough time for strikes to happen. Okay. Now, one of the other big myths I'm sure you've heard of, because I know Mr. Bailey pretty well, and then that is this idea that the North and the South, there's a misperception out there that before the Civil War, that the South was, they were the only ones discriminating. And yes, the South had slavery, which is a terrible terrible thing, as I'm sure you're going to learn even more about in the days and weeks to come. But it's not like the North was the land of equality. Okay, there was a lot of discrimination. If you definitely if you weren't a white male, and even some white males had discrimination based on maybe where they were from, places like Germany and Ireland, for example, immigrants. Okay, so there was considerable amount of discrimination against women and African Americans in the North. Now, in the South, well, it says cotton here, but truth be told, it's probably better you think of it as king cotton. So if you want to, maybe if you can type that in extra, or if you're writing, you write out the side, but this is a term called king cotton. Now, cotton wasn't always king in the Southern economy. That is another misconception in U.S. history. But it was only because of the good cotton gin, Mr. Eli Whitney's cotton gin. Now, I'm sure you've heard about it, about cotton gin and how it made it so much easier and more profitable to be getting cotton. All right. And that is a game changer for the Southern economy. Okay. Because what that meant was that there was really no motivation to develop any kind of industry. Industry was very limited in the South. All right. Now, there were a couple of reasons. One was, as you see here, the demand for cotton. Demand for cotton was huge, in part because you had all this great industrialization going on up here in the North. Well, they're demanding more cotton. Okay. Now, that's one reason. The other reason, there's a lack of capital. And by lack of capital, we mean money, actual, dollars and cents kind of thing. And the reason for that, not because the South didn't have money, but it's because their money was tied up in slaves. Okay, so they didn't have the money sitting somewhere. Their worth and value and things like that, they were in the slave trade. And so they just didn't have the money to go build a factory somewhere. And there just wasn't look, at the end of the day, guys, this industrialization and lack of industrialization all had to do with money, okay, about profit. And why, if you're in the South, okay, if you have this other opportunity to make what you see as relatively easy money because, well, you've been doing this a long time and you can make a lot more money doing cotton versus doing corn or some such thing, or tobacco or whatever, that's what you're going to do. In the North, you don't have that as an option. Farming's not an option. So you're looking for ways to make money. And this whole industry thing, now that's a profit maker. Okay, so that, again, it's a big deal. Now, the demand for slaves was also on the rise. Now, I'm sure you've heard that before the cotton gin, slavery was actually on the decline in the South. Okay, they were slowly making a transition towards maybe a little more industrialization and away from agriculture and slavery. But the fact of the matter is, when cotton became the king cotton, demand for slaves increased dramatically in the South. Okay, so as you can see here, two very, very different types of economies were set up between the North and the South. Okay, now I'm not saying this, but if I was a student like you are, I might kind of keep this in mind when I think about maybe why the Civil War happened. Just a thought for you, though. All right, now another big difference that most people don't even really think about, honestly, is in immigration. Okay, now you're thinking to yourself, well, why a difference? Why does this matter? Well, it does. So let's take a look, see if we can maybe put the pieces of this puzzle together for you. So the first thing you need to understand is in the North, the largest group of immigrants was actually coming from Ireland. Now you may be wondering, why would you leave such an amazing, beautiful, great country of Ireland? Well, they were starving to death. This thing called the potato famine. Now, the Irish diet was heavily dependent on potatoes. It was their main staple food. And, well, when that's all going away, you ain't eating. So they were starving. So they were going anywhere and everywhere to get away from that. And a huge millions and millions of them came over to the United States during this time period. Now, the next group was actually the Germans. Now, Germany actually wasn't a country at this time. Little known fact by most people, particularly your age, that Germany wasn't an official country, but there were German, what we call city-states types of things. And so the Germanic people, all right, and they were the second largest group. And part of that had to do with their Catholic belief system. All right, so you had this little thing called the Protestant Reformation, and that just led to a whole bunch of fighting between Protestants and Catholics. Whether you were in England or it was all over Europe, to be honest. And it wasn't a good thing. It was actually pretty bad, pretty brutal, quite a bit of it. But a lot of these immigrants, they were Catholic. And the fact of the matter is, Catholics were discriminated against for a long time. In fact, it was a really big deal when John F. Kennedy, JFK, when he became president, he was the first Catholic president in U.S. history, and that was a big deal, and actually still is for a lot of folks. Right, it's sort of a marker of how things changed and progressed here in this country. Now, in the South, things weren't. Well, look, they were worse for immigrants. Now, they weren't great for a lot of immigrants in the North. Don't get me wrong, but it was even more so in the South. They faced a lot of just prejudice, plain, pure, and simple. Okay. Now, you had this group in the South called the Nativists. Now, Nativists were everywhere, but they were primarily found in the South, and they were just against immigration. Their belief was just because you were native or born in this country, that somehow just made you inherently better. No real logic to that. It just is what it is. Okay. Now, they would eventually, many of them would form this thing called the Know Nothing Party. Because what instills confidence and, think that you know what you're doing by calling you, basically calling yourself the Know Nothing Party. Makes sense to nobody, but to them it did, I suppose. And they pushed for tougher citizenship laws. That was their big thrust. Now, it's hard to believe that a party that basically says we don't know anything wasn't very successful in national politics in the United States. Hard to believe, I know. But they weren't, and they fizzled out. You also see them sometimes called the American Party because, they were nativists and that kind of thing. So, all right. So, I mean, the fact is, guys, this is some of the immigration differences, all right? And this really reflects how the different groups of people were being treated, okay? And might lead you to believe why more immigrants, for example, would go to the North versus the South. Okay, now this may or may not be important when it comes to looking at the Civil War here in the next couple of weeks for you, but it's just something to think about. I don't know what Mr. Bailey's going to be doing for sure, but I do know my U.S. history, and so that's why I wanted to bring these two particular areas up to you. All right, now you'll notice one last thing I want to share with you. This is like bonus. You'll notice we didn't talk about the West. We only talked about the North and the South, and I know you remember your stuff from your sectionalism studies. I know you do. And really what happens, guys, is the West just sort of becomes split. Those who agree more with what the northern folks were believing, they get lumped in with the North. And then, of course, you have the group that was really more about what the South believed. They end up going with the South. Okay, because the Civil War is really about between the North and the South. It wasn't the North, South, and the West. That's not what happened. Okay, and so this is why we don't really talk about it. But you do see here in this map, it is what it is. Okay. All right, guys. So this is the end of this. You're going to have another video from me that explains an additional assignment that you guys are going to have. Of course, we want to make sure you do go ahead and get that assessment done. Get your test done on this particular lecture. Use your notes. Okay. I'm sure that if you get your notes done and everything taken care of from this PowerPoint, I'm sure you'll find that the assessment goes pretty well for you. Okay, but you're going to want to check out the last video that I'm going to have here for you. It's going to explain sort of that an additional a little bit different assignment than maybe what you've had so far this 9 weeks. And so just to kind of make you think a little bit about what's coming up, okay? So, well, guys, I do appreciate your time. It's been good. I've enjoyed it, this little presentation. And so, be on the lookout for that next one, guys. You guys have a good one. See ya.